So the game industry has been in a rough place recently. I don't think that's a secret at this point. We've had mass layoffs, studio shutdowns, and just recently this has impacted Square Enix, with them also having to be part of the layoffs here. And in the case of Square Enix, there's also been a lot of discussion about the recent Final Fantasy games 16 and 7 Rebirth not meeting expectations in terms of sales. But thankfully, we just got this incredibly eye-opening Twitter thread from Jacob Navok. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Jacob Navok, he was a director of business at Square Enix Holdings and reported to two different CEOs, that being Yoichi Wada and Yosuke Matsuda. So this is a guy that knows the ins and outs of Square Enix's business and is also incredibly familiar with AAA development. So what this guy is going to be saying in this Twitter thread is incredibly crucial. I'm talking about, I was very mind blown reading this. There is a lot of factors to AAA development that you and I just don't know about. And this is going to expose a lot of that for you. I can't stress enough just how mind blown I was reading through some of this. And so today, I really want to share this with you guys and open your eyes. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We are almost there. We're right there at 98K. Please go ahead and push us over the edge. And guys, I know there has just been so much doom in the gaming industry recently. I know you guys hate it. I hate it too. There's just been so much bad news. And unfortunately, I think that this thread here from Jacob really reveals the state of AAA gaming. And I don't think things are quite okay in the way that we want them to be. That doesn't mean that we have to be doomers about it, but I also think we can't really be blindly optimistic at this point either. So starting out on the thread, Jacob says, a thread on the recent Square Enix news regarding sales numbers and expectations. He says, as a reminder, I reported the two CEOs of Square Enix for the better part of a decade and ran a subsidiary. I also correctly predicted last year that Square Enix was going to break exclusivity. I'll note I have no confidential information that I'm basing my arguments on. To start, we need to look at decisions made on the titles under development within the lens of 2015 to 2022, not the lens of 2023. For example, Final Fantasy 16 would have started pre-production prior to the release of FF15, which was released in 2016. And yes, this is true that Final Fantasy 16 actually started its pre-production right after the release of Final Fantasy 14 Heavensward, the first expansion for FF14, which was, of course, just before the release of Final Fantasy 15. He then continues saying, this is a pre-Fortnite era. Budgets for Final Fantasy 7 Remake and Into Rebirth would have been around this period too. This is important to note, and we will get back to it. There's a misunderstanding that has been repeated for nearly a decade and a half that Square Enix sets arbitrarily high sales requirements, then gets upset when its arbitrarily high sales requirements fail to be met. This was not true when I was there, and is unlikely to be true today. Sales expectations generally come from a need to cover costs of development plus return on investment. This is incredibly important. A lot of people think that whenever Square Enix says that something failed to meet expectations, that they just made up a random number, completely arbitrary, and said, hey, well, it didn't make $3 trillion, so we consider it to be a failure. That's really not what happened. It just honestly is that AAA games have to sell this astronomical number to really be profitable. I mention it a lot, but Spider-Man 2 is a prime example. Spider-Man 2 needed to sell 7 million copies before it could break even. Now, thankfully, Spider-Man 2 has already sold well past that 7 million units. However, is this always going to be the case for every AAA game that has such inflated budgets? Well, not every AAA game is going to cost as much money as Spider-Man 2. They all do cost quite a bit of money, and that gives us a realistic ballpark of what you can expect for how much these games need to sell in order to be profitable. It's why we can see ridiculous figures like 3 million and think, how is that not a huge success? And then come to find out that it didn't meet expectations, and that's precisely the reason why. He continues, if a game costs 100 million to make and takes 5 years, then you have to beat, as an example, what the business could have returned investing 100 million into the stock market over that period. For 5 years prior to February 2024, the stock market averaged a rate of 14.5%. Investing investing that 100 million in the stock market would net you a return of 201 million. So this is our ROI baseline. Can the game net a higher return than this after marketing, platform fees, and discounts are factored in? This is actually a very hard equation, though it seems simple. The $70 that the consumer pays only returns $49 after 30% platform fees, and the platforms will generally get a recoup on any funds spent on exclusivity, meaning until they are paid back, they will keep that cash. Plus, discounts start almost immediately. This is true and something that I've noted for quite a while. When you spend that $70, it's not like the developer, the publisher, is actually getting that full $70 because the platform is already taking a third of that. So really only 2/3 of the money that you spend on games is actually paying the people who made it. And discounts for games sometimes happen before the game even launches nowadays, which again, that already begins cutting directly into the margins. When you see so many developers making Epic Game Store exclusives, it's because the Epic Game Store only takes 12%, whereas something like Steam takes 30%. And so each purchase on each game makes them so much more money on Epic Game Store than it does on Steam. And we'll actually be talking more about that later on in the thread. But I wanted to say that to give you guys an example of why those types of deals happen. It's actually so that they can charge you this same amount of money and still make more money on their end. He then says, assume marketing expenses at $50 million and assume that you're not going to get $49, but rather an average closer to $40 given discounts, returns, and other aspects. Now let's say in the first month you sold 3 million copies with $40 net received. We'll ignore the recoup. You need to surpass $254 million to make expectations. That's $100 million plus $101 million in ROI baseline, plus $50 million in marketing. At 3 million copies with $40 per copy, you've only made $120 million. You're far off. So that's why when we look at Final Fantasy 16, for example, a game that sold 3 million units at launch, and then there is discussion on whether that game failed or not, whether that game met expectations or not. So even though the game met expectations at launch, it would seem that the game didn't have enough legs to sell what they would be expecting at this point in the timeline. As Jacob pointed out here, you would need at least 254 million to make expectations. And that is with a modest development and marketing budget, not even nearly close to what many of these AAA games can cost. And so when you start doing the math, you start to see the AAA games industry is kind of broken. Everything needs to sell 8 trillion copies to survive at this point. He continues, from the statements made, it'll take FF16 18 months to hit expected sales. I use the stock market as an example, but actual ROI should be higher than the stock market averages. The sales figures required aren't wild expectations. The number of copies sold were too low, and my numbers are actually much lower than realities. Game dev costs are 2x higher, and marketing cost is also likely 2x higher. This makes ROI requirements higher too. His estimates of what these games cost to produce, like Final Fantasy 16, especially with those incredibly expensive icon fights, or Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth's open world, those things were not cheap to make. And so in reality, the games actually cost much more than that. And at around 3 million units sold, that is simply not enough ROI. And here's where things get even more difficult. He says, but that's not even the core of the problem. This is just proving that the expectations aren't set immodestly. The core of the problem is that the budgets were set in a period where the expectation was that the audiences would grow. Total audience growth was a reasonable expectation in the 2015 through 2022 era, and still is today. Not only has the industry grown significantly each year, but each day that new generations were coming of age, they were coming of age as gamers, meaning your total addressable population should be increasing, and you should be increasing your revenue. What's happened? Not just to Square Enix, but to the industry as a whole. Audiences' behavioral patterns are radically different than expected in 2015. Remember, I said 2015 was pre-Fortnite. The way it used to work was that you'd pick your release date similar to a Hollywood movie, stick to it, and consider the competition to be the titles releasing the weeks before and after. We would look at a Hitman or a Deus Ex release and consider whether there was a Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed coming out around that time, assuming that gamers had X amount of money to spend and Y amount of time. And if we wanted to get the full sticker price, remember, discounts eat into cash received, and also at that time, used disc sales were zero cash received. We needed to get as many sales in the first 2 weeks as possible. This is one of the reasons that publishers used to hate used games, because to them, they equated used games with essentially piracy, because to them, it really didn't matter if it was still a legal, authentic game disc. If you bought a game used, they didn't get any money from it. It's also a reason why so much of the industry prefers digital, because when you eliminate the cost of manufacturing the disc, and when you consider that there are no more used game sales, then you can see how much more profitable that digital is over physical. He then says, at that time, as a gamer, once you finished the most recent game you were on, you moved on to the next. You were looking for your next title once you finished the prior one. We wanted one of our titles to be the next title you bought to fill your gamer needs. This world would radically change in the last 6 years. Earlier this month, Kotaku had an article called 9 Great Games We Can't Stop Thinking About. There's a surprise 10th slide, and that is Fortnite. At ZWinzenZ writes in the article, and once again, another weekend arrives and I realize I'll be spending most of it playing Fortnite. Very close to maxing out both of my Battle Pass and Festival Pass, so that's the plan. I hate how deep Fortnite has its hooks into me, to the point of where I'm choosing to play it over brand new, cool looking video games. But I can't help it. I must finish these damn passes, get all the rewards, and earn the right to play other stuff. Well, until the next season starts up, and I once again return to Fortnite to drop in and level up all over again. It's sick, I hate myself, can't wait to play more this weekend. This is indeed the point. Square Enix are not competing against just the latest new installments. They're competing against every free-to-play online game that is constantly adding content and getting more robust over time. This is something that you hear a lot of people in the game industry talking about all the time. Think about how many hours that many of you spend playing Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail. I mean, it's essentially Fortnite for the weebs. And so all the hours that are spent gaming on games like those are not hours spent on playing and buying new games. I remember growing up, I had to wait for my mom to buy me new games. Otherwise, I had to go back and play the old ones. That's the way things worked. However, for this new generation, they can just go and spend all their time on Fortnite, spend all their time on Genshin, or all the other dozens of free-to-play games that are readily available to them. So much so that they don't really have the same need that we do to buy a full complete experience and play through that. All this is to say that if you have kids, please go buy them some real console games and kind of teach them the value of a complete single player experience. Because right now, our entire industry is competing with this. And right now, we are not winning the battle. He then says the assumption was that people would jump between products when they finished one. As you know, with free-to-play games like Fortnite or Warzone, they are evergreen. They never get old. They are always updating with new content and experiences. They can continue for decades. Candy Crush has been one of the best things ever over the last few years, and companies like Epic can continue to invest back into products to make them better, creating even higher barriers to entry for competitors. The game industry is still growing in revenue, but that revenue is increasingly captured by fewer live service games that are generating a level of stickiness seen in social media companies. There are reasons there are very few competitors to Facebook. Once the network effect stops, it can keep going on for a long time. Since Instagram, also Facebook, the only real competitor is an entire decade that showed up and could reach 1+ billion people was TikTok. And this is in a $1 trillion valued industry. Do you guys remember back in the day where we said, what will replace Facebook? A lot of us millennials thought this because we saw MySpace. And we had MySpace for a few years that was really popular, at least here in the US. I don't know about other English-speaking territories. And then after MySpace dropped, we had Facebook, and Facebook replaced MySpace. And so people would always say, oh, I'm so tired of Facebook. I can't wait to see what will come along and replace it. And one of the things I always thought of when people would say this was how Facebook tied all of your accounts in together. And so I always thought that, dude, if Facebook ever went down, we would be locked out of so many websites because we sign in with that ID. But obviously it's more than just your sign in. So much of life is tied into these social media networks. And now whenever someone creates something new, they just put it into Instagram, they put it into Facebook. If anyone else has ideas, they're able to copy them, buy them out, and shut that down immediately. Sometimes, yes, you will have an upset that comes in like TikTok, but for the most part, there isn't going to be any new competitors. Not in a big way and not very often. Maybe once every decade, something will show up. But even with something like TikToks, right? We already have YouTube Shorts, we have Instagram Reels. They've already assimilated it into their own package, right? So if somebody else gets another idea, and so anything cool about a new platform, you can just take it and put it into yours. We've seen Instagram basically assimilate every new social media app into itself. This is the same thing with these service games, right? Like, it's really hard to make a new battle royale that competes with Fortnite, because anything that's special about your new battle royale could just become a new battle mode within that game. I expect Fortnite, Roblox, Warzone, and similar products to continue to grow revenue. Meanwhile, put yourself in an older game's shoes. If you're a gamer with disposable income but less free time, and you have the choice of paying $70 to play 100 hours in FF16, or just continue to play Fortnite with your friends for free, you'll wait to see the FF16 reviews before you decide whether to switch off Fortnite. In other words, your switching costs, how good a game is, how exciting it needs to be, are substantially higher than when you'd finish the latest Assassin's Creed and look for the next title to fill your time, because you're awash with content options. Fortnite doesn't end. This is what I talk about when I talk about video game review scores and Metacritic, and why I know a lot of people are like, 70 is a good score, 75 is a good score, 80 flat is like a good score. And technically they're not wrong, right? In school, that would be like a C or like a low B. But the issue kind of becomes that we have so much entertainment, so many things that are incredible experiences. We're kind of flooded with content, right? And so whenever the average person is doing this opportunity cost evaluation, they end up trying to pick the thing that is most guaranteed to give them the best time for the dollar and the time investment that they'll be spending playing it. I know what you're thinking. That sucks, but it's true. We have limited time, limited money, and now we have almost unlimited good content that is coming out every day competing for your attention. Like, even right now, you're watching my video, but you could be watching someone else's video or someone else's video on this exact same topic. This means that I, Night Sky Prince, have to deliver you a very good, very compelling thing, and have to do so consistently, because otherwise you won't keep watching. And so at some point I have to cross a certain threshold in order to be interesting enough to dedicate your YouTube time to. And this is the same case for video games. The thing that becomes difficult about something like Fortnite is that Fortnite is not something like Netflix, right? Where you just subscribe to it and there's a whole host of shows. Fortnite is basically like, imagine your favorite show, but your favorite show is endless. Your favorite show doesn't actually end. It just keeps getting more and more episodes. Your favorite show might be One Piece, but you get what I mean by that, right? Like, and not like, oh, you have to wait for a new episode to come out. It's more like you can enjoy it every single day in perpetuity for forever. If that was the case, would you really have the time to dedicate to watch other shows? You might have some time, or you may schedule a little bit of time just to watch the show regularly, but you're definitely not watching nearly as many shows as you would be if your favorite show was not infinite and could always be turned on and give you novelty. And that is kind of the problem with the live service games like Fortnite and how they're impacting the industry. And you might also understand now why every single company wants one of these. Jacob says, this is the reason we see trends where games are either spectacle 10 out of 10 successes or disasters with little in between. There is no next hit being searched for in many cases. This polarization makes risk higher and costs higher too. We'll get to this in a moment. Now, what he says next here is something that you guys know I have been preaching about for a very, very, very long time. I think this is the core problem with one of the core problems with Final Fantasy that I've been talking about for a long while. If you guys have seen my streams where I discuss these issues in depth, I've mentioned this over and over again. He says, now if you're a younger gamer in your teens, you may not even be thinking about Final Fantasy. If you are 13 years old now, you were 5 when the last mainline FF15 came out. Your family may not own a PS5, and you may not care. You're satisfied with Fortnite or Roblox or Minecraft with your friends on your phone or laptop. I'm not saying this is the case for everyone, but it is certainly a trend. The old AAA franchises do not seem to be converting the younger generations that the industry was counting on for growth, and instead, free-to-play social games on mobile are where they spend their time. This is the reason every publisher chased live service titles. Audiences clearly gravitate toward them. This is the reason every publisher chased live service titles. Audiences clearly gravitated toward them, and profits followed in success. It is surprising that Square Enix, which had successful free-to-play live service mobile titles in Japan, left the AAA live service attempts to Eidos, rather than try to build those products in Japan. But dissecting this problem would likely require an entirely different thread. This is so true, right? Like, Square Enix had a number of very successful mobile games. And so the trend of Fortnite, Genshin, that really should have came from Square Enix. They really should have been the ones on that curve, right? If you honestly think about it, we should have had a AAA FF game that was like Genshin. Closest thing that we have to something like that is Final Fantasy 14. I'm not saying that I necessarily want that, by the way. I'm saying that from the perspective of what needs to be done in terms of pursuing these AAA live service games, especially since they've been really successful in Japan. And considering what Square Enix wanted to do, it would have made sense if they were the ones making these AAA live service games, like Jacob says. Not that I want any live service games really anymore. I play Final Fantasy 14, but that is pretty much the only live service game that I participate in. And even with FF14, I take very long breaks from it. Continuing, he says, regardless, the Fortniteization of the industry was not entirely predictable in 2015 when budgets were being planned. Even after Fortnite came out and well in the COVID period, it felt like industry growth was pulling all ships forward. Not just a handful, but that isn't what happened. But we have to get to the cost of development, asset generation, motion capture, textures, animation, engineering, infrastructure are incredibly expensive. Making games costs a lot of money. The recent layoff wave is generally a consolidation toward a new expected sales average in the number of titles being produced, not the cost of an individual title, which is going to continue to increase. Spider-Man 2 cost $380 million. Development costs have gone up, and switching costs of the consumer has gone up. And as a result, companies have to invest even more because it has to be a 10 out of 10 or gamers will stick to Fortnite. I don't mean literally Fortnite, but similar types of products. He's talking to you Genshin players. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which has a 92 Metacritic rating, can't get the sales it needs. Though that's complicated due to it being a sequel, these factors mean the status quo must change. Yeah, I mean, a game basically has to be a Baldur's Gate 3, a game of the year contender that is basically worth dropping everything for, a must play that you will have FOMO about if you do not go ahead and play it right now today. That is incredibly unsustainable. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is currently the frontrunner for Game of the Year, in my opinion. I can only think of a handful of titles that could possibly beat it, maybe the upcoming Metaphor from Atlas, but it's not like there's a long list of things that will beat Rebirth, and I think that Rebirth has a very strong chance of being Game of the Year. And it is incredibly bizarre to think the game that might win Game of the Year will not have done too well financially. Not to be a doomer about the situation, but that's pretty bad. So then what do we do? Well, he says this leaves only price left as a lever to pull. Since the price of games hasn't substantially increased relative to inflation, package disc games have gotten cheaper over the last 2 decades. The assumption was this was okay because the audience size would grow instead of the price, but the audience went to the platform titles. Prices for package disc games will go up. Companies have no choice. It is the only lever left. Just look at Kotaku's article about GTA 6's price point from this week. For those who don't know, Rockstar has indicated that GTA 6 may cost more than $70. That's right, GTA 6 could be the first $100 base game. This is where we're at, guys. This is where we're at. He then says, you're also seeing this trend with Ubisoft's Star Wars game. It's not because game companies are penny pinchers looking to fleece their users. It's because this is the only path left to make non-free-to-play service titles workable in the AAA space, given the cost and competition. Something has to give, and is getting good reviews, but it isn't increasing audience. They and the rest of publishers are going to have to increase the price point. Otherwise, live service titles will be all we have left, which points to the inevitability of the $100 video game, and that's becoming the standard price of games. Otherwise, AAA games look like they're not going to be sustainable much further. However, Jacob notes, there's another path that I can think of, which is increasing the take rate. If publishers can capture more of the platform's side revenue, they can moderate price point increases while capturing a better return on investment, because they'll be capturing, say, $50 or $55 out of $70. Tim Sweeney from Epic Games knows this, which is why he's fighting the good fight on platform fees, both at Epic Games and the App Store, to open the PC and mobile ecosystems. This is also why you see Microsoft and others taking advantage of his fight and starting their own app stores. You would think Microsoft would chip in for Epic's legal fees, given they're capturing the benefits with no risk. But this path will take time and is very hard on consoles, where the AAA publisher makes a lot of their money, so expect price increases to still be the norm. This goes back to what we talked about earlier in the video. It's why so many companies want to make Epic Game Store exclusives. It's not just Epic Game Store paying them for exclusives, it's because they actually get more money on Epic Game Store than they do on Steam from you. Your money goes to Valve when you purchase on Steam, and it goes more so to the developer and publisher when you purchase on Epic. Valve takes 30%, so does PlayStation, Xbox, etc. But Epic is only taking 12%, and if you've built your game on Unreal Engine, you don't have to pay the royalty fees on sales on Epic Game Store. This means that Epic Game Store is tremendously more profitable. So again, one of the ways that we can avoid this without having to increase the price of games is demand that the platform holders decrease their 30% royalty share. This is something I think should happen, as taking 30% from developers is kind of absurd. Why do you deserve 1/3 of the money just from hosting it on your store? I get the visibility and convenience, but it's pretty ridiculous. So Jacob did answer some questions in other threads, and I want to highlight some of those as they do reveal a lot of interesting information. This person here saying almost as if they should focus on other games, like how about remastering or remaking Parasite Eve? And let's not forget Chrono Trigger could use some love, just give Final Fantasy a rest already. Jacob replying, I love both Chrono Trigger and Parasite Eve, and many of the developers are my friends, but they are both niche audience franchises, and what Square Enix needs right now is radical audience increase in awareness. Final Fantasy is still their best bet to do so. They need to emulate Capcom, who is exceptional at reinvesting into its core franchises. I completely agree, especially the part about Capcom, because think about Resident Evil, right? Like Final Fantasy used to sell way more than Resident Evil, and now it's the opposite case. Resident Evil has grown and went from mainstream to mega mainstream, whereas Final Fantasy went from mega mainstream to kinda mainstream. The idea that, oh, we just need to remake Parasite Eve, we need to remake Chrono Trigger and all this other stuff, I think the issue with that is that we've remade Final Fantasy VII. And Final Fantasy VII Rebirth failed to meet sales expectations, it seems. And if that's the case, if we dug up the ultimate nostalgia well, Final Fantasy VII, the most popular game that Square Enix has made, and digging up Final Fantasy VII was not enough, then I don't think that remaking any of these other titles is going to fix the problem. You know, so often when we talk about this, I see people saying, oh, well, they should just remake this and remake that. Remakes aren't going to work here. Like I said, we remade Final Fantasy VII, and that didn't do it. If that didn't do it, if remaking FF7 didn't do it, then nothing's going to work, guys. There's no remake FF6 or something like that, and this will magically print money. I think that would have been the case, like, 10 years ago when people were really preaching for it and really wanted it. Back during the PS3 era, I think even that could have been, but now at this point, that's not the case. Jeff Grubb had said the sales trend for Final Fantasy is going down for multiple games in a row. I think we can stop saying the games are selling fine, the expectations are just too high. And Jacob says, yes, this is my point. Look at the number of games sold at launch week. It's not where it needs to be for what should be a growing industry. If the number of copies sold won't grow, then their only lever is price. Again, we can end the discussion about the expectations are just too high and all this other stuff. The objective nature of this situation seems to be it's not selling enough, but also conversely, these numbers should be enough. But this is what AAA has ballooned to be. It is utterly insane, and no, I don't think it's sustainable. I also want to shout out to my boy Subtext, who asked a really great question here. He said, this is a fantastic thread since replies aren't open. I hope Jacob sees the quick question. All this makes sense, but recouping platforms for exclusivity. Are you saying that Square Enix needs to repay Sony for what Sony paid in exclusivity rights? Why would SE take that deal? So that is actually a really great question, and Jacob offered us an answer. Here's what he had to say. I won't speak to specific Square Enix or Sony deals, but I can explain generally how it works. You have 3 types of exclusivity deals. 1. No recoup, which is often smaller amounts for small titles. 2. Partial recoup, very common. Portion of the funds will be recouped by the platform before the future funds are dispensed. 3. Full recoup, common. All future funds invested into must be recouped before future funds are dispersed. In the case of recoups, the publisher is not necessarily paying the platform. When you purchase a game digitally through the Sony store, Sony receives those funds first, so it can withhold payment of the rest until recouped. If sales are through a physical channel, then the publisher may have to cut a check back to the platform holder. Other ways this could happen is a partial recoup. Plus increase or decrease in percent royalty paid, or exclusivity arrangements for partial recoup against only a specific platform. That is, 30% of funds must be recouped, and then PC can be released. A lot of this is about leverage. If you have a powerful IP that Sony wants, you can argue for a partial recoup instead of a full. I'm not saying that any of these arrangements are the specific ones that Square Enix and Sony are under, just that industry deals take many shapes and sizes depending on who you are and what the other side wants. As for why any given publisher would accept on an exclusivity arrangement with a full recoup, because it offloads content risk to the platform. Games are expensive and take years, and sometimes are good, and sometimes are bad. If Sony puts $100 million into a game and the game is bad, they are now out of $100 million and you're out of $0. If the game is great, then it sells $200 million worth, Sony is fully paid, and you're $100 million richer with no risk. That makes perfect sense. That is a phenomenal explanation, and that explains why they take the exclusivity checks. A lot of people don't understand the exclusivity. They think it's just entirely foolish to do, but it's not quite as foolish of a decision as you might think, because it essentially mitigates or even eliminates the risk. Like going to a casino with the $100 bill that someone gave you. They only want their money back if you win, but only if you win so much that it exceeds the $100 that you have to pay them back. So if you go and you win $200, well then you only have to give them $100 back, and then you get $100 for free. Or more, right? So you make $400, well then that's $300 and you never had any risk whatsoever. But guys, this is the state of AAA gaming. This is the state of Final Fantasy. I agree with Jacob that Final Fantasy is still Square Enix's best bet, and they do need to go all in on Final Fantasy 17, making it the absolute best game that they can, and marketing it as hard as they can, and ultimately emulate the model of successful Japanese publisher Capcom. But even still, with the rate of live service and free-to-play games gnawing at the entire industry, it's really difficult for AAA to survive, especially when the budget for AAA games is so astronomical that you need to sell 5 trillion units for a game to even make $1.50 back. What do? How does AAA become sustainable? The only way to do it is to charge even more, and the consumer is already broke themselves. In this economy, that just isn't going to work. I don't want to pay for $120 games. I don't, and I know you don't either. But if we continue at the rate that we are continuing, AAA is doomed to fail in my eyes. I don't want to see that happen, and I don't want to see Final Fantasy fail either. This has been a very long video, one of the longest videos I think probably I've made on this channel in maybe ever, actually, outside of like podcasts and stuff. It's a lot to take in. But guys, this is the state of video games, and it sucks.